Aloha from the East-West Center in Hawaii. I'm Susan Kreifels, manager of the East-West Center's media programs. We are pleased to present our second program in our EWC Seminars Live webinar series. Our bi-monthly webinars are designed for multinational journalists and informed audiences to connect, inform, and source media stories. The themes were shaped by survey responses of over 165 journalists. As a former journalist, the theme today is one particularly close to my heart. Journalists reporting from COVID-19 hotspots around the world have faced unprecedented professional challenges and personal risks to cover life and death issues. Our 7 US and Asian speakers have been on the ground reporting from the very beginning of the pandemic, starting in Wuhan's seafood market and hospitals amid local government cover-ups, to Beijing, Hong Kong, Seoul, and Manila as the virus spread through East Asian streets. Then to Seattle, America's first hotspot, as Americans started to understand that this was truly a global pandemic. To South Asia, with massive migration of hungry workers, escaping India's lockdown cities, and where numbers of new COVID cases have surged. And to Pakistan, where hundreds of journalists have contracted the virus and some have died. Amid these huge reporting challenges, journalists have still faced growing government threats and media shutdowns. Today, we are going to hear from a group of very diverse senior journalists throughout the region, their insights, backstories, challenges, and lessons learned as the pandemic continues to grow more deadly. We appreciate viewers who are staying up late or getting up very early because, as I said last time, remember the East-West Center's programs covers a very broad swath of the world, from Washington, D.C. to Afghanistan. So we have viewers from around the world today. I want to remind journalists to check our website at www.eastwestcenter.org/journalism fellowships for professional opportunities. We offer about 10 diverse media programs a year, and we are very proud of our more than 4,000 journalist alumni in the United States, Asia, Pacific, and beyond. I'd like to take a moment to share our webinar protocols. Today's webinar is on the record, recorded on Zoom, and made available on YouTube for later viewing and sharing. Your microphone and videos are turned off according to Zoom protocols. Each panelist will speak for 5 minutes. Q&A will take place after panelists' presentations. To ask a question, write it in the Q&A tab in the bar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please specify if there is a particular panelist you want to answer your question. Join the conversation on Twitter, #EWC Seminars Live, and Instagram @EWC Seminars. And finally, our website for all of our webinar information, registration, and links is www.eastwestcenter.org/EWC Seminars Live. And now on to our exciting program. I know most of the journalists who are on this panel. I've traveled with some of them, and I am just so pleased to have them joining our panel today. They are a terrific group of journalists, very experienced, very diverse, and I know we will come away with a much broader perspective on COVID-19. So our lineup of speakers today, and they are going in the order of the virus spreading throughout the world. The panel, their bios are on our website, by the way. Panelists in order of appearance: Linda Liu, reporter, South China Morning Post. Hong Kong, Remy Inocencio, Asia correspondent. CBS News, based in Beijing, but right now in Tokyo. Jungmin Lee, reporter, Korea Broadcasting System in Seoul. Ruth Cabal, senior correspondent, CNN Philippines in Manila. Daniel Beekman, staff reporter, The Seattle Times in Washington State in the United States. Samia Khandelwal, freelance journalist in New Delhi. And Anila Khalid, national correspondent at the Independent Urdu in Peshawar, Pakistan. Our moderator today is Annalisa Burgos from KITV4 Island News here in Honolulu. Annalisa, I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you so much, everyone.
All right, I just unmute myself. Thanks, everyone. It's so good to be with you today. As Susan said, my name is Annalisa Burgos, and I anchor here for KITV4, but I actually have a lot of experience in Asia, and it's my pleasure to be with a lot of the panelists today. I actually lived in Singapore and Manila and was a journalist there, so I can understand some of the challenges that our fellow journalists are going through, so I appreciate the ability to share this experience with everyone. I wanted to start off by giving a snapshot of Hawaii, and we are, as a lot of people say, a rare success story. 946 cases, although we have seen the spike today and the last few days, as does the rest of the world, with about 20 reported today. So just a grim look at what's happening, a trend we're seeing all across the world, and it's coming to Hawaii, although we've been relatively sheltered from a lot of the devastation that a lot of the other countries have experienced. So to kick it all off, I wanted to pass it now to Linda Liu with the South China Morning Post. Over to you, Linda.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Oh, that's great. Sorry. So I'm in Hong Kong right now, so it's a good morning to everyone. So this saga really kicked off for me in early January. One morning I walked into the newsroom and my editors told me I was going to Wuhan. And this was only 3 days after the news of the coronavirus became public. So I really only had a few hours to get myself ready before flying into basically an unknown situation where we didn't really know much about this mysterious pneumonia that was appearing in the central Chinese city of Wuhan. And so when I arrived to Wuhan, at the time there were only around 40 or so cases that the government has disclosed. And my colleagues and I basically focused our attention to the Jingyingtan hospital, which was where they held the patients who had the coronavirus, as well as the Huanan seafood market, which is where the first clusters became identified. So right from the beginning, the Chinese authorities have been trying to hide information about this virus. And I had a first-hand experience of this when I was at the hospital trying to interview patient families. And it was there where a hospital propaganda staff discovered me and actually hauled me to a small police station at the hospital. And basically, they were trying to warn me and say, you are not supposed to be reporting here. You know, you should be waiting for official government information, and then basically kicked me out of the hospital. And I think that was a really telltale sign of China's early handling of the coronavirus, where they didn't really disclose information in time. And we saw, with the contagiousness of the virus, how this ended up costing lives and basically delayed effective containment of the virus. Because I saw that even in early January, when people knew that there was this virus spreading around, when I was at the Huanan seafood market, although it was closed, the workers who were doing cleanups there, they didn't wear masks, they didn't have protective gear. And so, because people were in the dark about really what this virus was and how contagious it could be, I mean, me and my colleagues were also in the dark. So we felt really fortunate that we came away safe without contracting the virus with very basic protective gear, such as just masks and gloves. And I also want to highlight some of the South China Morning Post reporting of the coronavirus in the 6 months since this new coronavirus appeared. We've tracked down the first identifiable cases of the coronavirus to the end of November. This was leaked government data obtained by my colleague Josephine Ma. And me and Josephine and another colleague also worked on another case of leaked government data where we found out there was a significant portion of asymptomatic cases that the government weren't making public. And we know now, a high portion of asymptomatic cases with the coronavirus actually can spread the virus. So this is a really important component for the public to know in order to contain the spread. So the lead government data indicated that as high as 1/3 of the cases at the time when they were tested were asymptomatic, when they were tested positive. So after this reporting came out, within 2 weeks, our reporting, and I think reporting from other media organizations actually led the, well, we would like to think led the Chinese government to also start disclosing asymptomatic cases of the coronavirus in China. And another exclusive that the South China Morning Post broke was my colleague Zhang Pinghui, who discovered that the Shanghai lab that first uploaded the genetic sequence data of the coronavirus to a public gene bank in the world. So this was published on 11th of January. And then we discovered that later this lab was closed for rectification. So this was a really concerning sign that the Chinese government really wants to control how the narrative of the coronavirus is covered in the media and around the world. So this information was cited by President Donald Trump when he wrote a letter to the WHO to threaten to withdraw the US from the organization for what he called a failed response. So that's
and with
all from
that,
me. Thank you.
yes, I was about to interrupt you. I wanted to let you complete your thought because then it got really interesting, Linda, but we'll get back into that a little bit later. Let's move on now to Remy Inocencio, who's actually a CBS News Asia correspondent, joining us from Tokyo, but has been reporting on this from all around the region. Remy.
Annalisa, thank you. And good morning from Tokyo here. Yeah, you know, Linda, what you were talking about there, in the dark, that's the phrase that has resonated with me ever since CBS News started covering this. We landed in Wuhan on January 20. We were there for 3 days, 3.5 days. But what I want to share is that even before we landed, as our journalist team decided to go in, or whether we wanted to go in or not, and knowing that many journalists are watching this right now, we had a really good and frank, open communication with our teams and our bosses in London and in New York on whether we should go in or not. And I think for anyone who wants to go into, well, wants is, I guess, relative, going into a coronavirus pandemic or any kind of natural disaster, it's always important to have that good, frank, and honest communication with your own staff there. The information that we had was really sparse. Of course, over the past, 5-6 months, we know so much, but at that time, we were also given the option of not going. And so we asked ourselves as humans, as people, or as journalists, you know, what was going to motivate us to do whatever. Obviously, we went in January 20th, and the first takeaways at the time was that it wasn't all that bad, because not many people were wearing masks. I remember landing at the Wuhan airport, and maybe half of the people at the baggage carousel had masks, half didn't. But by the third day, that was the afternoon, right before Wuhan decided to close down. And by the way, the news hadn't hit yet. We were just leaving, just for our own safety. We were leaving Wuhan airport. And within that 72 hours, 48 hours, it went from maybe, you know, noticeable mask wearing here and there to everyone at the Wuhan airport, jam-packed, everyone trying to get on an airplane. It's almost as if things changed on a dime. I think to your point, Linda, in terms of information and control, a lot of people just didn't know what was happening, but they knew that they just needed to get out of the city. Looking back, I am thankful that we went in, but also, if something had happened to our team, there were 4 of us. If something had happened to our team, I would also have regretted that someone might have gotten sick or even worse. But you know, information is what drives us. All of us here are journalists, and I think we all run to the fire versus running away from the fire to bring information to the world. And as a U.S. national media company, my audience, of course, is America. And looking back over the past half year or so, it has been interesting to see one the interest, but two, at least early on, the otherness of what the U.S. was looking at in terms of what was happening in China and in Asia. It was always like, oh, look what's happening across the Pacific, not thinking that it would affect America. Well, now we know it's happened, and it has also affected the U.S. But a lot of people always had it as a NIMBY, not in my backyard kind of thing. And then when it hit, of course, we know that there are administration officials who said that it wouldn't be so bad, playing it down. We now know, unfortunately, at least during the time of this webinar, that the U.S. is having its highest number of record cases right now. So I guess it motivates me, and I suppose it motivates most of us, all of us, to try to get as much information to educate the public as much as possible. And it's a call for more international focus. I'm happy that our bosses have focused so much on international news, and that we were the first US broadcaster to land in Wuhan at the time, and putting in so many resources from Wuhan to when we went to Beijing, where we were quarantined for a couple of weeks there. And then we went to Hong Kong to follow that cruise ship that was docked there. And then we went to Daegu, South Korea, and then Seoul, and then Tokyo. So in terms of following that arc, it has been really interesting to see the lockdown here, the lockdown there, the lockdown everywhere, and then sort of like an expanding bubble expanding to the United States. I only wish that, I guess, the information that we had could have been taken to heed faster. I think a lot of international journalists on this side of the world saw headlines in the US maybe 2 months after we had written them, saying, what is coronavirus? Do we wear a mask? How do we get it? I remember tweeting and seeing some peers on Twitter saying, wait a minute, guys, we were reporting on this 2 months ago, 3 months ago. Why are you repeating the same headlines? And it just showed to all of us here in Asia who had been covering it that the US, that Europe, the other weren't focusing or weren't taking it as seriously as they could have. I just wish that could have been faster. I think maybe part of it is more on us as well to try to connect the dots to other countries. I think we did the best that we could. But looking at it from the American perspective, again, I'm happy that CBS News is so in on international news, but Americans, I think there's a lot of inward-lookingness now in terms of what's happening with the coronavirus pandemic there, and with a focus on domestic news. So I will wrap up, and I will pass on to the next panelist. Thank you.
Thanks, Remy, for that. And I have been following your reports back in December and back in that time period, and a lot of my colleagues around the world, and I had been reporting that ever since, but it wasn't until, frankly, like you said, March, that people started to pay attention. So we have to work on something there, but thank you for that. Okay, moving on. Our next speaker is Jungmin Lee from KBS in Seoul.
Yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss here. So I start my my talk with the current situation in South Korea. Currently, the coronavirus situation in South Korea is just up and down, but South Korea still maintains quite a small number of infected and quarantine cases, fortunately, compared to other countries suffering from the worldwide spread of coronavirus. But as you might remember, South Korea was one of the earliest countries in which the epidemic started. And a few months ago, it was one of the countries with the most serious situation in the world, next to China. But now we have very few cases, so we have come a long way in a short time. So looking back several months ago, because the virus arrived here directly after the outbreak in China, it meant that we couldn't obtain any knowledgeable help to deal with this unprecedented matter. The South Korean health authority didn't really have much knowledge or much experience of how to deal with this virus, and neither did we journalists. And over time, overall, there are two kinds of difficulties. Firstly, we were placed in a situation where we won't be able to use our usual way of covering the issue, such as face-to-face interviews. So at the beginning of the epidemic, there was no set standard in regard to social distancing or the wearing of face masks. So we didn't know how to cover the issue while keeping both the journalists and the interviewee safe. And the second difficulty, which was more serious, was that we couldn't get any sufficient information from our own national health authorities because they also didn't know they also didn't have sufficient information about this brand new virus. So in the meantime, various rumors that we couldn't even verify had started to circulate. So we had to play two very different kind of roles, giving information to prevent further spread of the infection and also to lower people's excessive anxiety. So how we could overcome those difficulties? First, we started to what we could do in a limited circumstance. We intended to make it clear that our audiences, that the information we could pass on to them was limited. And we tried to make it clear that the information we gave was provided by official authorities very clearly. And we tried to distinguish honestly between what we could verify and we couldn't verify. We tried to warn people that our information might be incomplete and their degree of caution should be kept higher than our advice. And moreover, to counter misinformation and also disinformation, we actively utilize our existing fact-checking model. So we put even more journalists in our existing fact-checking team. And secondly, we call experts and health authorities officials into our studio as many times as possible and allocate more time for their warning and advice. So we decided to hand over our microphone to them because we acknowledge that it's better for us to stay as just a platform to connect epidemiologists and audiences instead of editing information by our own standard. And we believe that people tend to prefer or to trust the information conveyed by health authorities directly rather than by journalists. And moreover, as time went by and things got complicated, we started to create visual displays of as much information as possible to make it easier for people to understand the situation. And moreover, we realized that the information that the viewer wanted to hear was not just general, but specific information directly related to them, such as in which situation people were easily infected or the location of the information of the infection nearby their home. So we provided personalized information to individuals through our visual interactive article. So finally, I wrap up my talk about what we gained and what we lost. We gained people's trust in mainstream media back to some extent by contributing to raising the awareness of the coronavirus. We helped prevent spread of fake news by providing as much reliable information as possible, as quickly as possible. However, over time, the range of coverage increased and our alertness honestly weakened. So careless information began to increase and false reports began to be produced. So our attempt to convey information in an easy to understand manner became disadvantageous when our report were misinformed and spread quickly through social media and other platforms. So the more we did it, the less trust the public had in media. Thank you for hearing me.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Jungmin. I have to say, here in Hawaii, a lot of people looked at Korea as a model with the testing. No, seriously, like we had a doctor here that really emulated the drive-through testing model that you guys had there. And it's changed how we approach our strategy for fighting COVID. So I think a lot of people did appreciate that. Okay, now let's move on to the Philippines with Ana Cabal with the CNN Philippines in Manila. Over to you, Ruth.
Hi, thank you, Annalisa. So I have just a few pictures here just to give you an idea of how the COVID-19 crisis is here in the Philippines. So right now we still have rising cases. So we have more than 38,000 cases with 1,200 deaths. And we're the third highest in terms of cases here in Southeast Asia after Indonesia. And Singapore, right now we're on more than 100 days of lockdown, just to show you how it is here. People are saying it's probably one of the most extreme and longest lockdowns in the world. If you've heard, our president had earlier threatened to even shoot quarantine violators dead, but of course he had to take back that statement. And also we have some local officials imposing somewhat unusual and harsh punishment. If you see in one of the pictures, we have violators in dog cages. But looking now at the graph, our cases are still rising. We have an average of more than 300 increase in cases every day. So, so the virus is still spreading more than 100 days into the lockdown. It highlights the problem of slow testing. Our hospitals are in full capacity, lack of government assistance for poor families. Of course, the unemployment rate, we hit a record high of 17.7%, more than 7 million jobless Filipinos. So how are we reporting it? I guess most of my colleagues have experienced doing reporting from home. So this was actually my first Facebook Live. I used the wrong frame and I had emojis and stickers coming in, but eventually we were able to do reporting from home, and even with our colleagues from CNN International joining us for live reports. And these are just some of the pictures of local media reporting on the field. So what challenges did we experience? First of all, there's a problem of actually possibly contracting the virus here in the Philippines. One of the first few officials to have contracted the virus, to have tested positive, or actually senators, and we also have cabinet officials. So there's that danger, but as journalists, we are trained to face that kind of danger. Another challenge is the lack or confusing data from official sources. Our health department usually comes out with data every day, but over the past few months, they've been changing the classifications. They would say these are the fresh cases, these are the late cases, or they would just lump it together. So we can't get an accurate picture of how the COVID-19 is actually spreading in the country. And if you don't have that, you don't have, you wouldn't know how to properly report it. The government wouldn't know how to properly deal with a problem, like which areas do you isolate. Also putting it into context, the health department is reporting we have more than 4,000 backlog in cases in test validation. So what if most of those cases test positive? So that's a totally different picture of having a lot of positive cases in the Philippines. And just this week, to counter criticism about the government's handling of the virus, our presidential spokesperson declared that we're winning the war against COVID-19, but 300 cases a day doesn't actually seem like we're winning. Let me also mention that there are calls for the resignation of our health secretary, the top man in charge of dealing with the virus. The Senate actually passed a resolution calling for his resignation because of inefficiency, poor planning, delayed response, and misguided and flip-flopping policies. So that says a lot. And related to this is also the misinformation and disinformation spreading online, with the Philippines as the top internet and social media user. We're online for an average of 10 hours per day. So that's a problem about misinformation and disinformation. Another challenge which hits close to home is, of course, the media attacks. I guess many have heard how the government shut down the biggest network in the country, ABS-CBN. So it has about 11,000 employees, and then we're talking about 11 million homes, just because their franchise was not renewed by Congress. But it's very unusual because there are mechanisms to still allow them to operate. So many see this as a political move because President Duterte has repeatedly said that the station is biased for not airing his ads during the campaign and instead airing the ads of his negative ads by his critics. Senators say this is ill-timed, and insensitive media groups are saying, of course, this is an attack on press freedom to send the message to other networks to take it easy and not to be too critical of the government. Same goes for the case of Maria Ressa. She was convicted of cyber libel, so I won't delve into the details because she just filed her motion for reconsideration. Maria says that what happened to her is a cautionary tale for government critics. Many are saying this is a blow not just to press freedom, but to democracy in the country. Maria and Rappler are facing at least 7 other cases. So these events create the impression that the media is doing something wrong, that it should not be trusted, that we're anti-government, but we're actually just doing our job, our watchdog function to guard the guardians. I mean, when their government, under a new law passed during the pandemic, asked to reallocate 275 billion pesos, that's over $5 billion, we have to see where the money goes and that it's being used legally and properly. When the government deploys uniformed personnel, of course, we have to make sure that there are no abuses. When the government eases quarantine rules, we have to make sure that health and safety protocols are still in place. And let me also mention that while we're all dealing with this, our Congress railroads the passage of the anti-terrorism bill. So many see this as a draconian measure to make it easy for the government to crack down against terrorists and against critics, and to easily tag them as terrorists. The president has not yet signed or vetoed this, so maybe in about 7 days, it will just lapse into law. So this pandemic has emphasized all the more why our job is considered an essential service. So we have to be here to be on guard. We have to make sure that the public can get information that is factual, accurate, useful at this time when information is a matter of life and death. So thank you for listening. That's it from the Philippines.
There we go. Thank you, Ruth. I was just going to say I can attest to all of that because I used to work at ABS-CBN too. So that had been in the works. It was just precarious timing that this coronavirus happened, and then unfortunately lost another source of information for people. So thank you for that overview. Let's head to Seattle now with Daniel Beekman from the Seattle Times. Over to you, Daniel.
Great, thanks so much. And it's going to be difficult to go after a number of television journalists. I'm a print reporter, not used to this kind of thing. But I should also say that my beat has not been coronavirus in particular. I cover Seattle City Hall at the paper, so local government. But of course, my work has touched on the coronavirus stories. And I thought I could sort of try to quickly mention 3 lessons from reporting on the COVID-19 pandemic here in Seattle that I could mention. The first is that the pandemic reminded us here in Seattle that we belong to an international community. I mean, that's obvious, of course, and we are a Pacific Rim travel and business hub, and we have residents from around the world. And people were reading about what was happening and watching what was happening in East Asia. But Seattle is not the largest city on the West Coast of the United States, much less the largest city in the United States. And I don't think people here expected that we were going to be the first place where the virus emerged in the U.S. Our local public health authorities knew it was a possibility, but they weren't prepared to be first. But that's what we were. We had the first confirmed case in the U.S. here in our area in January, and then the first confirmed deaths were here in February. We had an early cluster of cases and deaths at a nursing care facility that I reported from fairly early on in the crisis, and it was an intense time. And so a lesson from that, I thought, was that we do need to be better, even as local journalists, about paying attention to what's going on internationally, and that's certainly a lesson. Another thing that I thought about, especially for me and my role covering local government, is the pandemic has really put a spotlight on our housing crisis, especially since 2014, as Seattle-based Amazon has grown and other tech companies have grown here. Housing in our area has become incredibly expensive, sort of New York or Los Angeles levels of expensive. And, we have thousands of homeless people who are sleeping outside on any given night. We have huge numbers of people who can barely pay their rent under normal circumstances. And then the coronavirus hits, we have an economic shutdown, and people are really struggling still. And, maybe half of the stories I wrote during the first 2 months of the pandemic here were about housing and how local government was trying to respond to that crisis by banning evictions, by trying to get rent relief to people. And that question is still hanging out there, even though our economy is starting to open up and also our cases are increasing. But eventually the emergency here is going to be, the official emergencies are going to end, and our eviction moratoriums are going to end. And there are a lot of people with a lot of rent to pay back, and I don't know what's going to happen. I'm not sure anyone does. The third, let's see if I have enough time here, is that I've written something like 20 stories in the past month, and I'm not sure that more than a couple of them have been related to COVID-19. And that seems remarkable considering, what we've been through, what we're still going through, but we're still dealing with a pandemic. But, in my coverage and in people's attention here, a lot of the crisis, the coronavirus crisis has taken a back seat to the protests against police brutality and institutional racism that have erupted across the country and here in Seattle in response to the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Now I can't even remember how long ago that was, weeks ago, and more than a month ago. And, it's interesting, I wrote a story on May 24th about all the challenges our mayor, the Seattle mayor, was facing at the time, including the coronavirus. And I mentioned that right before it sort of emerged here, the mayor had taken part in a parade. And I wrote that she, now a parade, a crowd of people downtown was the last thing in the world that she wanted to see. She was talking about concerts and sporting events, spectator sports being closed for another, for the rest of the year at least. And then shortly after that story, protests erupted, and we had tens of thousands of people marching through the streets demanding justice. And we don't think, there aren't signs, the experts don't think that those protests have caused our cases to spike. They think it's more about testing and the increasing and the reopening of our economy. But that's just something that was really remarkable, where we went from sort of one huge story to another huge story, just like that.
All right, thank you so much for that, Daniel. And I echo a lot of the concerns that you mentioned in your presentation as well. All right, let's turn now to India with Soumya Khandelwal. Where is she at? There she is. Over to you.
Hi. Hi, Annalisa. Thank you so much for having me here. Let me begin with saying that India right now is at about 600,000 cases, which is increasing every day at almost 20,000 cases spike every day. But on March 24th, when the country was getting increasingly perceptible to what was happening across the world, the Prime Minister of India announced a nationwide lockdown to prevent the spread of COVID. And people were requested to stay put wherever they are. But in reality, for a major migrant population that lives hand to mouth, it was impossible to stay put and afford a living in bigger cities. In order to ensure that they had a roof over their head and they could eat every day, they had to get back home because, they at least have some fields and some agriculture to fall back to, and at least they know that they have houses where they could really ensure a living. So what started was a mammoth process of reverse migration. It's being called the second largest migration after the partition of India in 1947. And people set onto streets with whatever means they had. They were walking, they were cycling and hitchhiking for hundreds and in some cases thousands of kilometers to get back home. I was in the capital of Uttar Pradesh at the time that this was happening, which is also one of the states which faces among the higher rates of migration. And I was documenting what was happening for National Geographic. And what was mostly different in this case was that while a lot of journalism that was coming out was from the metro cities, where major chunks of the populations were now coming out on the streets and finding ways to go out, I was on the receiving end of it, where people were walking up to in this time. The problems that were mostly happening at that point of time were that if you would read the newspapers, at least in Uttar Pradesh, they had started to look like government propaganda. So they were mostly news pieces coming out as press releases. And even if you speak with journalists and trying to get in touch with NGOs which were really working on the ground, people refused, like the NGOs refused to help because they said that the government is trying to control what is the news that's coming out of the state right now. Because of the fear of which, a lot of journalists reporting locally were not really stepping out of their houses, and they were depending mostly on the press releases. And I think that in itself was a depiction of how much the government was trying to control the image of what COVID would look like. At the onset, it did look like the government had a plan in place and it imposed the lockdown when India had very few cases, which was a ray of hope. But I think in the beginning of June, the government started to unlock the country, which was another disaster altogether, because here we are at more than 600,000 cases and we're just unlocking the cities, and there are very few social distancing norms or precautions that are being followed outside of the main metro cities in the smaller villages and towns of the country. A recent report, which was titled India Media's Crackdown During COVID-19 Lockdown by Rights and Analysis, Risk Analysis Group, stated that as many as 55 journalists had faced arrest, registration of FIRs, summons or show cause notices, physical assaults, alleged destruction of properties, and threats for their reportage on COVID-19, or for exercising freedom of opinion and expression during the national lockdown between March 25th and March 31, which is a major cause of concern. In any case, this government has been notorious for its anti-press agendas. There have been a lot of publications which have been brought to task and brought to align with what the government wants them to say. And this heightened level of hold that the government is trying to practice is kind of worrisome. While reporting on the ground, there was this one instance when I was driving across a highway and there were dozens of migrants which were held up. And while we pulled up the car to see what was really happening, the cops there, it was a police checkpoint, and the cops were basically trying to help the migrants out because they realized that these people don't really have ways to get back home. And what they were mostly doing they were getting them to hitchhike on trucks or whatever modes of transportation which were heading in the direction of their respective cities and states. But even the cops were conscious that this isn't what the government guideline is. They were doing it on humanity grounds, and just seeing that there was a media presence, they were really hassled about how it would unfold. Fortunately, I could reason out with them and I could tell them that the reportage that I'm doing is about the larger migrant story, and that I'm not there to crack down on individual police persons. But one particular statement that the cop made really stayed with me, and he said that, if all these people do not die of COVID, they'll die in their journey to get back home. That's all from India. Thank you, Annalisa.
Thank you so much for that, Samia. Very striking, I know, for what's happening there. I know international media is tuning into what's happening with kind of large groups getting together, and the recent wedding that I just feel like it has been in the headlines here. So we're thinking about what's happening out there as well. All right, last but not least, our final panelist is in Pakistan, Anila Khalid Khan from Peshawar. Over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Annalisa, for having me. to speak on such an important topic on COVID-19. In today's webinar, I'll try to share what I have personally observing and what first-hand information I have been receiving while reporting on COVID-19 from Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province of Pakistan, which is being identified as hotspot of coronavirus, and where mortality rate is 4.5%. That is significantly higher than any other province of Pakistan. So today I'll try to convey all the information very simply, and my contention is very simple. You see, coronavirus pandemic is an undeniable fact, and the whole world is faced with this pandemic. There are countries and places where there is higher number of corona patients, and then there are countries and places where there is lower number of patients. Pakistan is no different in that regard. But what makes us different than the rest of the world is our challenges. These challenges are, which I'll be talking about today in this webinar, are the rumors and stigmas, conspiracy theories that are circulating in Pakistan, especially in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. These rumors are circulating since the very beginning, ever since COVID-19 entered Pakistan. Coronavirus entered Pakistan in March, and first death from COVID-19 also happened in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. So I was talking about the rumors and stigmas and the conspiracy theories that are circulating here. For example, if I talk about that as well a little bit, due to shortage of time, there are so many stories and things that I have heard personally and I've seen, but I will share just a few examples. For example, people say that coronavirus is a hoax. Even now, from the very beginning till mid and even now, people still think in Pakistan that coronavirus is a hoax. And then they think that some Western organizations probably have, funded the hospitals, doctors, or the government to inject poison in patients and to kill them for their ulterior motives. The condition in rural areas even is pathetic. It is because of the poverty and the lack of education, lack of awareness, and then social issues and religious dogmas. People would believe anything they would hear. So even there was, in the beginning, there was a rumor, a very funny kind of rumor, in which people were told that a baby has born and that baby says to make a black tea, add some salt in it, and drink that at midnight. And that is a cure for coronavirus. People did that literally. So after that, people were told that another child has born and that baby says that don't do that. And then people were, they were clueless. So because of these rumors and kind of conspiracy theories, the situation is pathetic here in Pakistan, and the government is clueless that how to control it, this situation, how to control the spread of coronavirus. On the other hand, in Pakistan, in the beginning, what happened, which is still in exercise, in practice, and that is that people are afraid of government quarantines and isolation wards as well. So because of that fear, also people started hiding their symptoms and cases in patients. They would prefer to stay at home instead of going to hospitals. Actually, my point of telling you all this is that why and how a number of COVID-19 patients increased in Pakistan, especially in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, which is identified as hotspot of coronavirus that I just mentioned. So the fear of this quarantine, because once a patient would go to the quarantine or isolation ward, his or her family was not allowed to visit them. Even if that patient would die, family members were not allowed to participate in the funeral. So this also became a reason of the increase in this virus, and a chaos took place. So due to rumors and stigmas, the situation now is worsened than ever, and now health analysts think that how would we get rid of this virus? Even if a day comes that the whole world gets rid of this virus, maybe Pakistan wouldn't be able to get rid of this virus because of the social beliefs, the religious dogmas, the poverty and cultural issues, and so on and so forth. Because of these reasons, Pakistan wouldn't be able to get rid of coronavirus very easily. And if I add one more thing in the end, that is that Pakistan is one among those two remaining countries which is still faced with polio, and the reasons are almost the same. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anila, for that. And you know, I just saw that a lot of us all share common themes in what we are going through as reporters in our respective countries. You know, misinformation, roadblocks from government not being transparent, not giving us the facts and the information we need to do our jobs, protecting ourselves, getting the support from our organizations, and then just kind of the stigma that we're seeing, and a lot of the confusion amongst the public. I know in Hawaii, we did a similar thing, Anila. I hear people talking about these home remedies they thought would cure them. And I just couldn't believe it, because, I thought, this is America, but, a lot of the residents, they felt the same way. So they just didn't feel like they could trust some of the information that was out there. So how do we handle this? All right, so thanks again for everyone giving this. We did have some questions come in. So I wanted to direct certain questions to certain people. And I wanted just to, for the sake of time, because we're only here till 5:30, but if you have something really pressing that you feel like you wanted to add, feel free to unmute yourself. But just for the sake of time, everyone does have a particular question directed to them. So let's go back to Linda over at the South China Morning Post. And this question's for you. Can you share whether scientists have determined how and where exactly in China, open market versus laboratory, COVID-19 originated, and if so, how reliable are their conclusions? And I know this is something that we discuss all the time, the origin of the virus.
Yeah, I think the world is really hanging on an answer right now on the origin of this virus, but I have to say there is no answer right now. There's a lot of conspiracy theory of the virus being, a bioengineered or escaped virus from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. I have to say that scientists all agree there's no evidence to support that theory. And with regards to the Huanan seafood market, where the first cluster was linked to, the China CDC has tested samples from that market. And they, from the samples that they've tested, there's also the theory that the virus, was brought to the market from somewhere else, just from, tracing the genetic sequence data of the samples they found at the market. So I think this is a really big question to be asked, and the WHO is actually gearing up to send a second team to China to try to find the answer to this question. And we hope that, the Chinese government and the international agencies and scientists can work together and try to solve this question and really try to prevent it from being politicized, because that's no good for anyone. And we really need to treat this as a scientific question and not a political one.
Good point on that. The next question for Rami, do you expect more Americans to take an interest in foreign affairs and international news coverage now that we're seeing this really is a global pandemic and it crosses borders?
My gut is I'd like to think so. However, because the most infections that are being reported now are in the United States, I think it is continued navel gazing, really, looking at what's happening within their own country. I also think, though, that as journalists and as newsrooms, there's a balance that needs to be struck, right? Between us as international journalists pushing for the stories that we know are important. And it's also important for news leaders back at home, for us in New York, for the shows, to say, you know what, this is important. It might not be, the explosions that might be good for television, but it has as much impact and as much mental and health, explosiveness that needs to be translated as well. So I think it's also incumbent for newsrooms to lead as much with things that might not necessarily be top headlines or front page news. I mean, as journalists, we all read and watch a lot, probably more than most, right? But I admit, I get tired reading the news and I say, you know what, I got to stop. But there's something about that next page in the paper, and yes, I still read the newspaper, where I'm like, you know what, maybe there's something there that I don't know. And I have never been let down by flipping that page one more time and saying, oh, that's something I didn't know. And when I put it down, I've learned something new that I feel better for, rather than just sticking to my lane. So I guess in wrapping up, I would just implore all of us journalists, as well as news leaders in newsrooms, to try to make time for more international news, even if it's just a couple minutes, but it could open the world and it could change lives.
And you make a good point. You have to pitch your case, right? I know as a local news journalist, it's a lot harder to fight for those international coverages, but I feel like it's so important. You have to have those champions, and you're lucky you have an organization that really supports, international coverage. So that's great to hear. Is there any, just a quick follow-up, was there any tip from you on how to generate more interest? Maybe for all of our, what advice you would give to our reporters here too? Sure,
yeah. Finding the domestic angle in the international angle, I think it bears repeating, in that, with coronavirus, the shows were interested, the CBS News shows were interested in the American angle, of course, whether it was an American stuck in Wuhan who couldn't get out. Then you use that character to expand to what's happening elsewhere. Jane Doe stuck in Wuhan for 2 months. Why is it happening? And we build it out from there. Same as we do in print as well as in radio, or an American stuck on a cruise liner who can't get off. Those were the stories that we were able to gain interest in order to build out as well. I think that's what we continue to need to do. But as much as we are the advocate for the news, we need advocates and allies in our newsrooms, wherever they are back home.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, let's turn now for this next question for Ruth. Like we said, a lot of us have talked about the challenge of working with confusing and conflicting government statements. We see that in the Philippines, especially concerning COVID-19, and you've had to really force the hand to clarify science and policy responses. So how are news organizations over there doing this? How are you trying to get the correct information you need to accurately inform the citizens there?
Of course, we still have to report what the official government agencies are saying. So for now, that's the health department, or that's the presidential spokesperson. But aside from that, we have to make sense of what they're saying, and we have to get a better understanding of that. So what we would do is we would interview other experts, like say experts from the University of the Philippines and other doctors, so that we can get a better gauge of what the information means. Like earlier, I told you, I said in my presentation that The government is claiming we are winning the war. The government is saying that the positivity rate is going down. Yeah, sure, but you have to make sure that, are we really winning? So we have to also present what's really happening, the reality on the ground. The government is also saying, hey, we now have a capacity of doing 50,000 tests a day. But I would always say, and I would always try to get other information, are we actually doing the 50,000 cases? And then if we would do follow-up 50,000 tests, and then we would do follow-up questions to the health department. And it turns out that even if we have a capacity of 50,000 tests, we are only doing 10,000 to 11,000 tests a day. So that's, you know, a small number of tests being done. So those are the things we do, that we try to ask more questions, we try to do more follow-ups, and we also seek sources from other experts outside of the government. So yeah, we try to make sense of what's available from the government, and at the same time make it more useful and more understandable for the public, so they can get a clear sense of how the situation is in the Philippines.
So more holistic, definitely. This next question is for Daniel. Why are health experts denigrated by some media outlets in the US? And should the industry work to combat misinformation generated by colleagues? If so, how?
A great question. I mean, here in Seattle and in King County, you know, I think people have been pretty good about following the guidelines laid out by our local health officials, and we've tried to, you know, give those authorities a platform in our coverage. You know, something that's kind of interesting here locally is that, you know, I cover city government. We also cover our county government. Our public health authority straddles those two. And so it's a little bit removed in that way from the politicians in a sense. And I've talked to some experts here who think that that has helped with the general public health messaging. They've said that sort of best practices are to try to take the information sharing out of the hands and mouths of the politicians and put it with the experts, so that there are, you know, there's less polarization sort of in the public listening to that. And so maybe that's made it easier on us as a media outlet. I'm trying to think if there are cases where we've had to go out and debunk, you know, bad reporting, and none are coming to mind here in our local area, although there may have been some that I'm not thinking of. But, you know, just to plug, you know, my colleagues, and I'm sure it's the same in a lot of newsrooms for the other panelists, but, you know, the last 3 months or whatever it has been, 4 months now, has been an all hands on deck in our newsroom. And part of the reason why I think we've been able to put good information out there is just because every single person that I work with has been working really long hours and long days. You know, we've been out on the ground trying to get the best information we can. Just quickly, one thing I guess I could mention is that our local government, our state government, was not doing a good job of providing information on cases in nursing homes across the state. And of course, we had our first major outbreak in a nursing home here. And so some of my colleagues, you know, did the legwork and basically built our own database for the public to provide that information. So that wasn't a case of debunking, you know, attacks on government information, but it was a case of us sort of doing that work for our local government.
Mm-hmm. All right, thanks for that. And, you know, we did hear from Linda saying that how do you prevent science from taking on this political slant, right? We know that politicians will use these kinds of information or propaganda to, you know, build their platform. So let's turn to Korea, where, you know, again, Jungmin, we have been applauding the science that's coming out of that country. Can you explain South Korea's contract tracing efforts and how you've been able to be successful beyond this political verbiage that everyone else is challenged with? Oh, we need to unmute her. There you go, Jungmin, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. And actually, I think like our fortunate was our government was quite reliable, and also our health authorities are quite reliable and transparent for all of the information about the coronavirus. And actually, the reason why they are quite transparent and reliable is because they have a kind of very similar experiment from 5 years ago. So we had a kind of similar virus with coronavirus, so-called MERS. So I think our health authorities are quite well trained and quite well educated. And what they needed was, what they needed for media was to amplify their warning to our audiences and our population. So that was, I thought, and we thought that was what we should do. So like our, at the time, at the early stage of the pandemic, like our role was to amplify the advice of health authorities to our audiences, and unfortunately people followed it very well. So I think that's a definite that's definitely one of the factor of the succession in South Korea.
And the contact tracing efforts?
Contact tracing effort. Yeah, I'm not really sure, but actually, like the government start to trace like all the path of the patients, and they put some kind of app in their smartphones. And if we turn on the smartphone, like that, and that means the government can follow the path of all the people, all the patients. So I think that was very helpful to find out some infected cases and also confirmed cases here.
Was there just kind of this willingness to participate amongst the citizenry, to get tested, to be traced? Because I feel like here in Hawaii and maybe in other parts of the US, they just don't want to be tracked. I know we're trying to install thermal screening and facial recognition in the airports here, and there is a lot of outcry, like we do not want that here. So, you know, because of privacy issues. So I'm just curious, is there a mindset amongst the people to be willing to, you know, to be part of this whole, they buy into the system?
Yeah, I think they're like at the beginning of the epidemic, there was a kind of resistance about tracking record. But like as time goes by, like the government have persuaded people that you should be tracked, because it's not about your freedom, but about the consideration for others. So and the media, like what the media did was also to persuade them and educate them that is the consideration for others. So I think that's well done here.
Yeah, that's unique, I have to say. I think that's unique. Let's turn to Soumya for the next question. What has been the most challenging experience you have personally faced in reporting COVID-19?
I would say the most challenging experience here is to know what is it really that we should expect or that's really happening on the ground, because in terms of information, it is very limited. You know, we're completely dependent on the governments on what's the scale of the pandemic, and despite the fact that the government would like to undermine what's really happening, it's a lot of research goes into the data that comes out to be able to understand what is it that the government is really saying and what is it that we should really believe and accept. So I think the biggest challenge was in terms of the information, and it wasn't until we were really out on the ground and reporting that we really know what was happening there.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned this pandemic spin earlier. Has it improved at all since? Have you felt like there's the reporters are doing a lot to prevent that from overtaking the minds of the citizens there?
Whatever difference there is mostly in the metro cities. You know, there are sufficient media houses which are located in the metro cities, and there is sufficient information that's coming out of it. And despite government's effort to undermine it, information is certainly coming out, but there is hardly any credible reporting that's happening from the rural areas and from the hinterlands. So that is one blind spot that we have. And like for a lot of migrants who've come back, so we have a state of Uttar Pradesh where I am, which has conducted a little over 300,000 tests so far. We have smaller states which have gone up to 700,000 tests and have fewer number of cases, but Uttar Pradesh, for example, refuses to pull up its socks and accept the fact that we've had such huge migrant populations which have come back and which need to be tested. So these are spots which are not being investigated and looked into enough at this point of time.
And our next question for Anila, how do you mitigate your exposure to COVID-19? And are you concerned about your own family's possible exposure as a result of your work? And I know this is something that all journalists have to grapple with, but especially in Pakistan, there's a lot of journalists that have caught it and some died, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's true. And that is because there were many channels, many newspapers who were telling their reporters to go to the field and get data and report from there. They were not told to stay at home and work from home. So that was the reason that many journalists got this virus, and also because initially many of the reporters were not aware of this virus, and they didn't know how to protect themselves. They took it very lightly. And I would also add with that there were reporters who were like all other people were not believing this virus, and they say that, okay, we will see, whatever will be. So that was the case with them. As far as I'm concerned, me and my family took it very seriously from the very beginning. I went out, I did work from the field, but in a manner so that I stay away from the people I am interviewing, and report in a way that my personal, I stay away from the danger that is I'm exposed with. And if I talk about my family, my relatives, my immediate family, 58 people caught this virus, and out of 58 people, only 3 people went to the hospital, went for the tests that resulted positive, whereas all other people didn't go for any test. So this shows that how people are behaving towards this virus. And even some of our relatives were angry with us that why we are not going for their, to ask their well-being and to meet them or let them enter in our house. So because that is behavior of people in many of parts of it. Not all of them, but you see a small fraction of people are exercising the caring for SOPs and maintaining social distancing and staying at home and all that. So that's how.
Just by a show of hands, I'm curious, how many of you have actually been tested for COVID-19? What? Jongmin? No? Oh, wow, not even Raimi. I'm actually shocked. Who raised their hands? I was, Ruth and Soumya. Linda, I'm surprised. Actually, you guys, I'm like surprised. You guys are on the front lines.
So let me weigh in on this actually,
Yeah.
Annalisa. I want to get tested, but here in Japan, where I've been living in exile since February 26th, it's almost impossible to get tested here because of medical guidelines. Unless if you are extremely visibly sick with a high fever for, I forget, a few to several days, you won't get cleared to get tested here. Not until recently, but there was one point where I thought maybe I might be getting sick, and I wanted to go get checked. I had a headache that just didn't go away for like 3 or 4 days, and I asked my colleagues, my local colleagues here, and they said it was almost impossible. We tried, and they said, you know, only if it gets worse, then maybe. So I want to, and I'm glad that other people can get tested, but here in Japan, you know, you can't. Some people say it's because they wanted the numbers to be low because of the Olympics, and to try to keep that down. You know, less testing you do, fewer numbers you find.
That sounds familiar. I mean,
no
you know,
comment.
Okay, but Linda, you know, I have to say, I'm surprised too that you weren't, because again, Hong Kong, I would think, is it because of the asymptomatic? And you just said you did all these investigations about asymptomatic being one of the critical, you know, carriers, and we're talking about that all the time. So why are these restrictions still there?
Yeah, I mean, I am very lucky. I haven't had any symptoms in this time, so I just haven't gotten tested yet. Although in Hong Kong it's quite accessible. If you're a Hong Kong resident, you can go get tested if you're close contact, or if you want to pay for it, it's only about 180 Hong Kong dollars, which is maybe less than 20 US dollars.
Oh.
And yeah.
That's a deal.
And it's very affordable. I have to say, I think with the asymptomatic transmissions, this is why it's so challenging, and why you've seen some places have closed schools and not let students go back to school, because, you know, with younger people, so like children, teenagers, young adults, they think it's likely some of them could be asymptomatic carriers, so they can never, you know, get sick, but they are actually passing this in their communities. So this is why, yeah, a lot of places have lockdowns. I mean, what we're seeing in Beijing now, they've had another outbreak, and that one's a mystery as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. The swine flu, is that what you're referring to?
No, not the swine flu.
Oh,
but
I just read about the swine flu too. So, you know, yeah, I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, I can quickly touch on the swine flu. So I think a team of Chinese scientists came out with some research they've done, and they were worried about this new strain of swine flu. But from what I saw, the WHO actually, I think just this morning, sent out an email with regards to the swine flu. And what they're saying is this is not a new strain. The strain has been identified by a global influenza monitoring network before. So it is on the radar of scientists, and they are watching out for this. So we should be alert, but maybe not go into alarm mode yet.
Okay, well, I don't know. Maybe the lack of alarm mode last time got us into a predicament, but yeah, that's not my opinion. I'm just throwing it out there. Okay, let's go to Ruth for our next question. Switching gears, because I know we were talking about what's happening there with the media, with Maria Ressa, you mentioned, of Rappler, who has a tie to Omidyar here in Hawaii, also ABS-CBN's licensing issues. So has that, I know you work for CNN Philippines, has that caused some changes amongst your newsroom and how reporters like you and in other outlets, how you're approaching things with the government? I know the government doesn't like to be criticized ever.
Well, I would like to think that right now we're still doing the same thing. We're still very transparent in terms of reporting. Like, I mean, it hasn't discouraged us, I would say, like personally for our network. We had more than 100 days on lockdown, and we released a series of special reports as to how the government dealt with or is dealing with the COVID-19 crisis. And of course, we pointed out the weaknesses, the alleged inefficiencies in some government agencies. So that really didn't stop us from criticizing or reporting any negative things. And I think that's the same for the other networks too. Maybe on the ground, what we just noticed is that when you cover on the ground, for example, protest rallies or these rallies for the anti-terrorism bill or in support of ABS-CBN, I think the police and the military are just more maybe on guard when it comes to media personalities. Like recently, a radio reporter was almost arrested because he was reporting without his ID. Of course, he was doing a live report, and then he just had a phone camera. So the police were saying that they thought he wasn't a real reporter. So I think they are just more conscious and more, when reporters are visible on field coverages. But other than that, well, we're doing our jobs and reporting about the COVID-19 crisis. There are some distractions in terms of political issues, and if it's something that we have to discuss, we also have to come out with a comprehensive report about that. But right now, most of us are focusing on the pandemic, but of course also reporting issues like Maria Ressa and the ABS-CBN franchise issue.
Yeah, I know it's been, I know when I was there, it was just so draining. I don't know how you guys keep up the energy, the fatigue of, I had officials like lie to my face, and I don't know how to respond to that. Like, how do you respond when you know that it's a lie? I mean, how do you, I don't know, there's there tips from, for someone like you, I know that it's really difficult at press conferences.
Yeah, it's funny because like a few weeks ago, the presidential spokesperson, virtually berated on air one of our reporters, saying that she miscoded him, but we actually have his code, and he wanted us to apologize and change our article on that. But of course, we stood our ground. I guess the only thing you can do is fight it with the truth. So just stick it to their face that this is what you said, and so this is what we're reporting. So I think that's how you handle these officials that you were talking about. And as long as we also know the issues, that we also know what we're talking about and the real situation, we will be maybe courageous enough to confront them with the reality on the ground.
Yeah, that's what we need, courage and energy, I know. Jungmin, same question for you. Are you feeling over there for the Korean reporters, are they feeling fatigued, drained? I know compared to the other conversations we've had with officials in India and Philippines, for example, they're more transparent over there. So how does it translate with your newsroom?
Yeah, definitely. Like the fatigue had been stacked. And we are almost exhausted in covering the issue. And like the more stressful is that we are still even though our health authorities are quite reliable, we still face the danger of false report and false information. So what we have found, the solution we have found was that when we find out that our report was wrong and the information we gave was misinformation, the only solution is to confess it as quick as possible. And we should repeat the confession again and again and again, while people are recognizing that this is misinformation. So yeah, actually this is very hard, to accept that our report are all misinformation, and it was quite stressful, but I think we should accept it.
Mm-hmm.
Can I jump in there just really quick?
Yeah, please do.
Jungmin, I appreciate those comments. Coming at it from the perspective of Wuhan, when we were on the ground, everyone thought and strongly believed that the Huanan seafood market was ground zero.
Yeah.
and then there was reports that maybe it wasn't, and now we really don't know, right? I thought, I think I went back to some of my reports and I said, did I say definitively it was? Did I say it? Did I say it? I got really concerned. Looking back, I think I said that it's believed that it was ground zero, and I thought, okay, whew, I didn't say it was. With that said, I could have just as easily said that. Any of us could have said that. I'm sure other people did. But it's important for us to, I guess, couch our reporting to make sure that we say, based on current information, or, cite analyst sources or doctors, because things could change, right? So to your point, and I think that's something that all of us, that I have definitely learned to make sure, we always attribute someone else, just to cover us, just in case. And then when we report, just to make sure that, these things can change. And we've learned that this pandemic has changed and evolved and changed again based on new information.
And just wanted to get some feedback from the others about how you're feeling with the second surge, the second wave. I know a lot of us are starting to see that now that things are reopening. Some people are digging their feet in and saying that we're not going to pause on the reopening. Maybe Daniel, you haven't spoken in a while. What do you think? Oh, you have to unmute yourself. Okay, go ahead.
All right, sorry about that. One thing I'm going to do is just share some information, the latest today from Seattle. Not something that I reported today, but one of my colleagues. Today, our governor, the governor of Washington, Jay Inslee, announced that a whole raft of new restrictions. So he's not, we're in a phased reopening approach for our economy and our activities, and he's not halting where that is, but he announced new restrictions. For example, a new statewide order that's supposed to take effect next week, barring businesses from serving customers who don't wear facial coverings and who don't wear masks. And we haven't had that here. Even earlier on in sort of our lockdown phase, where people were still going to, supermarkets and such. And so I'm going to be really interested to see how people in the public react to that restriction, and the prospect for being the certainty of being refused service if they come in to a business without a mask. And he made that announcement as the state reported 716 new cases today in our state. That's the highest daily total since the beginning of the pandemic. So including 3 deaths. So, our testing has been ramping up, but it was a striking day of news here on that front.
Yeah. Anila and Soumya, what about masks over there? Are people actually practicing all these tips that we're being told now that places are having large gatherings? What's the feeling over there?
Not at all. People in the beginning, people didn't care about any SOPs because they were not aware of this virus. In the mid, they understood, okay, what this virus is. And then we saw some people wearing masks and gloves and some were not wearing. And these days, the situation is very strange that people are not at all wearing masks. Only a small fraction of people are doing that, whereas the rest of the people don't care about it at all. If you go to the market or bazaars or anywhere, you will see people sitting close to each other and talking to each other, sitting in the gardens and even having get-togethers. So this is how the situation is in Pakistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa these days. So,
wow.
No.
Yeah. What about you, Soumya? What about in India, in the places you've seen? Are they taking it more seriously and
I think
practicing?
what's mostly happening in this part of the world is that there is this sense of fatigue that has set in. People were extra cautious when the lockdown was initially announced, but at every opportunity that they would get to express, people were really coming out coming out with a lot of aggression. And sometimes, when the Prime Minister said that we need to applaud our health workers and people who are on the ground, people made, parties out of them. So with now the unlock phase 2 in place, there are pockets where people are very, very cautious, but there are also people who have given up all sort of precautions. And the good part is that people are aware. If even if you go down the rural areas, people are aware that there are these social norms, and even if they're not following them and you tell them that please wear it, they oblige and they practice it. But broadly, there is a lot of carelessness about how they approach the virus. And even in cases where there are colonies, and I'm talking about Delhi, where there are colonies where there have been quite a few COVID cases, you can see people walking around without masks and taking it rather casually. I think somewhere the sense is that it'll affect everyone. So it might as well affect us, and let's be past it. But on a broader sense, there's also an apprehension. We don't really know if this will go away from India anytime soon, because it's just been into the metro cities right now. And with fewer tests happening and with fewer reports coming from rural areas, we just do not know how long it is here to stay. But everyone's assuming that it's here to stay at least for this year.
Mm-hmm.
So, Annalisa, I would also like to add with that a strange thing I'm hearing these days from people. This is coming from first-hand information. I myself heard it from people saying, if you ask them that why are you not wearing masks, why are you not following SOPs, standard operating procedures, so they say that we want to contract this virus so that as soon as possible we start a normal life.
Build immunity. Is that the
Yes.
feeling that if they get it, they can fight it, build the immunity?
Yes, there is this feeling. And in fact, Pakistan is already moving towards herd immunity, because if we talk about facts, there are a lot of people who have contracted this virus. But if you go to the official websites, you won't find that much of the number. The number is lower than what the actual figure is. So this is why we say that Pakistan has already, some of the analysts say, health analysts say that Pakistan might already have moved towards herd immunity. And perhaps for Pakistan, that's the only solution that will work. Because if we go to for a vaccination, if a time comes that vaccination is introduced, there would be many people who wouldn't opt for this vaccine. Based on their, religious dogmas and their beliefs and stuff. So they might not go for that.
Well, I know
so
the goal
only
for everyone.
option for us. Sorry,
I was just going to cut you off because we're running out of time, but I was just going to say, I think the goal for everyone is to get to herd immunity, but practice the safe practices until we get there. But sorry to cut you off, Anila, but I actually went over. If this was a TV show, I would have been off air already. So bad TV anchor. But I wanted to just again take this time to thank everyone. I know we could discuss this. I find everything so fascinating, and to hear all the experiences that you guys have been through. Thank you for sharing that with us. And this recording is going to be available through the East-West Center. So again, I want to thank our panelists, Linda Liu, South China Morning Post in Hong Kong, Remy Inocencio, CBS News Asia correspondent, Jungmin Lee, KBS in Seoul, and of course we have Anna Ruth Cabal, CNN Philippines in Manila, and Somya Kanderwal, photojournalist in India, Daniel Beekman in Seattle Times, and finally Anila Khalid Khan in Peshawar, Pakistan. That's a lot of us. Gosh, 7 journalists plus, well, I'm a journalist too, so 8 journalists in one seminar. How did we do it? But you know what's great? The next seminar is going to be with Philippine journalist Maria Ressa. And we know her as the Time Person of the Year because of what she's been doing for press freedom over in the Philippines, a global advocate who was sentenced to 6 years in prison for cyber libel for up to, we don't know that yet. She's fighting that, of course. Maria will speak on press freedom under fire, addressing global threats to the press free press and democracy. And the moderator there is Sheila Coronel. She's the Dean of the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University, my alma mater, woohoo, and co-founder of the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism. So if you enjoyed this panel, you'll love that discussion. She has a lot of interesting insight to share with us as well. And that will be on Tuesday, July 14th, 4 p.m. Hawaii time. That will be on July 15th, 10 a.m. in across Asia, Beijing, Manila, Singapore, all our countries over there. And you can register at eastwestcenter.org, EWC Seminars Live. All right, so I did my housekeeping. Aloha, everybody. It's good to see you. Thank you so much. Stay safe.
Thank you.